The acrid stench of burning rubber sliced through the morning air, thick and suffocating. Smoke curled toward the sky, a black column twisting above the neighborhood like a signal of war. Jake's stomach clenched. His sleek, black Dodge Charger, the car he had worked years to afford, was engulfed in flames, orange tongues licking across the hood, thick plumes of smoke rising as glass cracked from the heat. The heat seared his skin even from feet away. Neighbors stood at a distance, some filming, others whispering. His hands curled into fists as he took a step forward, but a voice stopped him cold. "Damn shame," Chad drawled, his voice thick with mock sympathy. Jake turned. The HOA president stood with his arms crossed, a smug smile curving his lips. He was dressed in his usual golf polo and khaki shorts, his sunglasses reflecting the flames. Behind him, a few HOA board members stood like lackeys, their expressions carefully neutral. Jake inhaled deeply, forcing himself to steady his breathing. "You did this." Chad let out a chuckle, tilting his head as if amused by the accusation. Now, let's not go pointing fingers. Maybe this is what happens when someone refuses to follow community guidelines." Jake's vision went red. For weeks, Chad had been on a power trip, sending fines for non-existent violations, slipping passive-aggressive letters under his door, and escalating threats after Jake refused to join the HOA. The man ran the neighborhood like his personal kingdom, using petty rules and intimidation to keep homeowners in line. Jake had ignored him at first, assuming the harassment would fizzle out. But this was something else entirely. "You're out of your damn mind," Jake bit out, stepping forward. The heat of the fire was nothing compared to the fury in his chest. "You think you can get away with this?" Chad's smirk widened. "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. And unless you have proof, I'd be real careful about throwing around accusations." The words were deliberate, taunting. Chad knew exactly what he was doing. A siren wailed in the distance, and moments later, a fire truck screeched onto the scene. Firefighters jumped out, moving with quick precision, blasting foam over the burning wreckage. The crowd murmured, some stepping back, others filming more aggressively. Jake's heart pounded as a police cruiser followed. 2 officers climbed out, their expressions unreadable as they approached. One, Officer Reynolds, had the kind of weary look that said he'd dealt with too many of these neighborhood disputes. Reynolds glanced at Jake. "That your car?" Jake nodded stiffly. "We'll need to ask you a few questions," the officer continued. "Any idea who might have done this?" Jake turned to Chad, who gave an exaggerated shrug. "I mean, I suppose anything's possible. Could be an accident. Could be some outside vandalism. Would be a shame if someone left it unlocked. Maybe some kids got in and whoops." A few chuckles from the HOA board. Jake clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. He could see it happening already. The police writing this off as a random act, Chad and his cronies keeping their hands clean. He wanted to scream, to demand an immediate arrest, but years in the legal system had taught him something valuable. Justice wasn't about emotion. It was about proof. Reynolds sighed. "We'll start an investigation, but without witnesses or camera footage." Jake already knew the answer before he asked. "Security footage?" One of the board members shook his head, feigning regret. "Cameras have been down for weeks. We've been meaning to get those fixed." Jake exhaled sharply. Convenient. Too convenient. Chad stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Jake could hear. "You're new here, so I'll spell it out for you. This neighborhood has rules. People who don't play nice tend to have bad luck." Jake didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled. A slow, calculated, knowing smile. Chad thought he had won. Thought he had backed Jake into a corner, left him powerless. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that Jake wasn't just some homeowner. He wasn't just a guy with a burned car and a grudge. He was a federal prosecutor. And Chad had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Jake sat in his home office, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face as he scrolled through the HOA's financial records. The fire report had come back inconclusive. No fingerprints, no security footage, nothing to prove arson. Chad had covered his tracks well. But that didn't mean he was untouchable. If there was one thing Jake had learned in his years as a prosecutor, it was that arrogant men always left trails. His fingers tapped methodically against the desk as he pulled up public records. Homeowners associations had to file paperwork, budgets, meeting minutes, expenditure reports. Most people never looked at them, trusting their board members to manage things fairly. Jake, however, knew better than to trust men like Chad. Within minutes, the inconsistencies started appearing. Inflated maintenance fees, funds allocated for non-existent projects, payments marked for community improvements that had no actual paper trail, HOA dues funneled into vague expenses that didn't match any completed work. The numbers weren't just off, they were intentionally manipulated. Chad wasn't just running a power-hungry neighborhood dictatorship. He was stealing from his own community. Jake leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Chad had played this game before. The realization settled over him like cold steel. The way the police had brushed off his car fire, the carefully timed malfunction of the security cameras, the smug confidence in Chad's voice. It all pointed to a man who had been getting away with things for years, but he had underestimated his latest target. A notification pinged on Jake's phone. A text from his next-door neighbor, Lisa. "You should see this." She attached a screenshot, an email from Chad to the entire HOA. Jake opened it. Subject: Urgent Community Update. Residents: It has come to my attention that certain individuals have been causing disruption within our peaceful community. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to undermine the safety and integrity of our neighborhood. As such, the HOA board is currently reviewing petitions for removal of any homeowners who refuse to comply with our standards. Your cooperation in maintaining the harmony of our neighborhood is expected. Failure to adhere to community guidelines may result in further action. Chad was trying to get him kicked out. Jake smirked. Lisa sent another message. Asterisk, he's been going door to door trying to get people to sign it. Thought you should know. Asterisk. Jake tightened his grip on his phone. Chad was desperate. He could feel his control slipping, so he was doing what men like him always did. Pushing harder, trying to scare people into obedience. But fear was a tool Jake didn't respond to. He stood, stretching out the tension in his muscles, then grabbed his keys. It was time to stop watching and start making his next move. Outside, the neighborhood was calm, eerily so. Porch lights glowed softly against the well-manicured lawns. A few houses down, he spotted Chad standing in a driveway, clipboard in hand, speaking to an older couple. Jake approached slowly, catching the tail end of Chad's well-rehearsed speech. Simply about keeping the community safe from people who don't respect the rules. "I'm sure you understand." The older man hesitated, his wife shifting nervously beside him. "I don't know, Chad. This all seems a little extreme." Chad smiled, the kind of condescending expression a man wears when he knows he's already won. "Trust me, it's for the best. We don't need troublemakers here." Jake cleared his throat. "Troublemakers." Chad stiffened, turning. His expression flickered, just for a moment before the smirk returned. Well, well. Speak of the devil." Jake crossed his arms. "I see you're busy. What is this, a loyalty test?" Chad chuckled. "Just making sure everyone's on the same page. You know, real members of the community." Jake tilted his head. "Funny. I don't recall signing up for a dictatorship." The older couple exchanged nervous glances. Chad's jaw tightened, but his tone remained light. "You're new here, so let me give you some advice. This isn't the kind of place where people do whatever they want. We have a system, a structure." Jake took a slow step forward. "You mean a racket?" Chad's smile thinned. "Careful." Jake lowered his voice just enough that only Chad could hear. "No, you be careful. I've spent my career putting men like you behind bars. You can hide behind your board members and fake bylaws all you want, but I've seen the numbers. You're stealing from your own residents." Chad's smirk faltered, just for a second. Then he let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "You really don't know who you're messing with, do you?" Jake smiled. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Chad's fingers tightened around his clipboard. You think you're gonna scare me? I run this neighborhood. You're alone here, and no one's gonna back you. Jake held his gaze. We'll see about that. The tension crackled between them, a silent battle neither was willing to break first. Then, Chad took a deliberate step back, plastering on a fake grin. Enjoy your evening, Jake. Jake returned the smile just as false. You too, Chad. As he walked away, he could feel Chad's eyes burning into his back. He didn't need to turn around to know what the man was thinking. Chad had spent years manipulating, threatening, controlling, but he had never faced someone who could fight back. Jake reached his house, stepping inside and locking the door behind him. His mind was already working, calculating his next move. Chad thought he had power. Jake was about to show him what real power looked like. Jake worked in silence, the only sound in his dimly lit office the quiet tapping of his fingers against the keyboard. His desk was now covered in printouts, financial records, email exchanges, legal documents. He had spent years dismantling criminal enterprises, tracking patterns of corruption, following trails of money that men like Chad assumed no one would ever notice. And now he had everything he needed. Chad had been siphoning HOA funds into personal accounts under the guise of community improvement projects. Thousands of dollars were missing, disguised as vague maintenance costs that no one had questioned. Until now. Even better, Jake had tracked payments made to a private contracting firm that didn't actually exist. A classic shell company scheme. Fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. All federal offenses. Jake leaned back, exhaling slowly. If Chad wanted a war, he was about to get one. But first, Jake needed to set the stage. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with tension. The fallout from Chad's petition had started to ripple through the community. Some homeowners were scared, afraid of retribution if they spoke out. Others, already fed up with the HOA's absurd rules and fees, were beginning to ask questions. Jake just needed to push things further. He started with an anonymous tip. A carefully crafted email landed in the inboxes of a few key residents, those who had expressed doubt about Chad's leadership but hadn't yet spoken up. Attached were financial records, highlighting missing funds and suspicious transactions. A simple message followed. Asterisk, do you know where your HOA fees are really going? Asterisk. By midday, the first cracks in Chad's control began to show. Residents whispered in hushed voices, huddled in driveways, exchanging glances that weren't just annoyed anymore. They were suspicious. Then came the second strike. Jake forwarded a package of documents to a local news station, including evidence of Chad's financial misdeeds. He knew journalists loved a good scandal, especially when it involved a smug suburban tyrant who had been bleeding his neighbors dry. It didn't take long. By evening, an article had gone live online. Local HOA president under fire for alleged misuse of community funds. The story spread fast. Social media picked it up. A few homeowners, those Chad had fined relentlessly for minor infractions, started sharing it. And just like that, the floodgates opened. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was suffocating. Chad sat at the head of the table in the community center, shoulders stiff, jaw tight. Around him, board members shifted uncomfortably. The room was packed. More residents than usual, some standing against the walls, others gripping printed copies of the news article. Jake leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, watching. Let's get started, Chad said, his voice clipped. Silence. Then, a woman near the front, an older homeowner named Mrs. Caldwell, cleared her throat. Actually, Chad, I think we'd all like to hear about this. She held up her phone, the article glaring on the screen. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Chad's face barely moved, but Jake could see it. The slight twitch of his eye, the way his fingers clenched against the table. This is nonsense. A smear campaign by people who don't appreciate what this HOA does for them. So the missing money isn't real? Someone called out. Chad let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. These are just accusations. No actual proof. Jake stepped forward. You sure about that? All eyes turned to him. Slowly, he pulled out a folder, flipping it open. Because I found some pretty interesting discrepancies in your financials. He walked to the front, placing the documents on the table in front of Chad. Unauthorized withdrawals. Payments to a non-existent contractor. Personal expenses disguised as HOA fees. Want me to keep going? The room went still. For the first time since Jake had met him, Chad had nothing to say. That's privileged information, Chad finally sputtered. Jake smiled. No, Chad. It's public record. And I just made sure the right people saw it. A phone rang somewhere in the back of the room. Then another. Homeowners checked their screens, eyes widening. Someone turned their phone outward so the crowd could see. Another news update, this one far worse. Federal investigation launched into HOA corruption case. The board members paled. Chad's hands tightened into fists. You think you can? Jake leaned in slightly, his voice low enough for only Chad to hear. I don't think, Chad. I know. And right now, the IRS, the state attorney's office, and the local fraud division are all looking into you. By the time they're done, you won't just be out of this HOA, you'll be out of options. Chad's breath hitched, his confidence cracking for the first time. Jake straightened. I'd suggest you start preparing for what's coming. He turned toward the crowd. Or better yet, you could all vote him out right now. Since, democracy and all. The room erupted. Shouts. Demands. People standing, voicing their frustrations, their anger, their long-held resentment toward the man who had ruled over them with an iron fist. Chad stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. This meeting is over. Jake watched as he stormed out, board members scrambling after him. He didn't stop them. They had no idea this was only the beginning. Chad's downfall happened faster than even Jake anticipated. By the next morning, the HOA president's smug confidence had been reduced to a frantic scramble for control. The homeowners had spoken loudly. After the explosive meeting, a petition circulated to remove Chad from his position. Within hours, signatures flooded in, far surpassing the required majority. But Chad wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat gracefully. Jake watched from his porch as Chad stormed from house to house, clipboard in hand, trying to sway residents back to his side. The charm was gone, replaced with thinly veiled desperation. He knocked on doors, pleading, cajoling, demanding. No one answered. Even the ones who had once feared him now saw him for what he truly was. A fraud, a bully, a man who had overplayed his hand one too many times. By noon, Chad sent an email to the community, laced with defiance and thinly veiled threats. These baseless accusations will not stand. I have done nothing wrong. Any attempt to remove me is an act of betrayal against this neighborhood, and there will be consequences. Jake smirked as he read it. Chad was rattled. He was trying to maintain the illusion of control, but it was slipping through his fingers like sand. Then came the real blow. At exactly 3:45 p.m., a convoy of black SUVs rolled into the neighborhood. Federal agents stepped out, crisp suits and sharp eyes scanning the cul-de-sac with practiced precision. The sight alone sent a ripple of unease through the residents, curtains twitching as neighbors peeked from their windows. Jake leaned against his car, arms crossed, as he watched Chad step onto his porch, his face an ever-shifting mask of confusion and barely concealed panic. The lead agent, a woman with a no-nonsense expression, approached him. Chadwick Monroe? Chad straightened, forcing himself to smirk. That depends. Who's asking? The agent didn't flinch. Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit tax evasion. Step down onto the walkway. Silence fell over the street. For a moment, Chad didn't move. His eyes darted, searching for an escape, for someone, anyone to intervene. But there was no one left on his side. Even his loyal board members stood frozen, unwilling to risk sinking with a doomed ship. Then his gaze landed on Jake. Understanding flashed across his face like a lightning strike. His lips parted, fury twisting his features. You! Jake just smiled. Chad lurched forward, a final act of defiance. But the agents were already on him. His arms were yanked behind his back, metal cuffs clicking into place. He shouted, twisting, but they moved with practiced ease, ignoring his protests. "You can't do this," he bellowed. "This is my neighborhood. I built this place." The lead agent ignored him, reciting his rights in a monotone voice. Jake took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Chad could hear. "You spent years bullying and scamming these people. You burned my car. You thought you could do whatever you wanted because no one would stop you." He let the words sink in. "But you never saw me coming, did you?" Chad's eyes burned with hatred, but beneath it, there was something else. Fear. "You think this is over?" Chad hissed as the agents started leading him toward the waiting SUV. "You think I won't find a way to?" The moment the words left his mouth, a voice cut through the tension. "Smile for the camera, Chad." Jake turned just in time to see Lisa, his next-door neighbor, standing on her lawn, phone raised, recording the entire scene. And she wasn't the only one. Nearly every neighbor had stepped out, phones in hand, capturing every second of Chad's humiliation. Some whispered in hushed tones. Others watched with barely concealed satisfaction. A few openly cheered. Chad's face drained of color as realization struck. This wasn't just an arrest. This was public disgrace. Within minutes, the first video hit social media. HOA tyrant taken down by FBI. You love to see it. The neighborhood group chat exploded with messages. Memes surfaced within the hour. Photos of Chad's arrest edited onto dramatic movie posters. Captions like *HOA Gate. The final chapter. Someone even created a hashtag. #Chad's Reckoning. Jake couldn't help but chuckle. Poetic justice had never tasted sweeter. By the time the agents drove Chad away, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted. The fear that had once loomed over the community had lifted, replaced by something lighter. Relief. Victory. Jake let out a slow breath. It was over. Well, almost. The next day, he received an official notice. Chad was permanently removed from the HOA, and the remaining board members had either resigned or were under investigation. The HOA itself was on the verge of dissolution, as residents pushed to take back control. 2 days later, Jake picked up the keys to his new car. A sleek, black Tesla. He pulled into his driveway, stepping out just as Lisa walked by. She grinned, nodding toward the car. "Nice upgrade. No chance of this one going up in flames." "Huh?" Jake smirked. "Not unless the HOA tries to make a comeback." Lisa laughed. "Doubtful. But if they do, something tells me they won't last long with you around." Jake glanced around the neighborhood, one that was finally free of its self-appointed dictator. He nodded. "Yeah, I think we'll be just fine."